In this lecture, let's quickly learn about custom property binding with directives. So we already know how custom property binding works with components, but let's now understand how we can use custom property bindings on directives. So in the last lecture, we created this beta highlight directive. Now, when we use the selector of this beta highlight directive on an HTML element or a component, in that case, in the web page, when we move our mouse on the host element, its background color will change to pink. And when we move our mouse away from the host element, its background color will change to transparent. So if I go to the web page, when I move my mouse on the host element, its background color is changing to pink. And when I move my mouse away from the host element, its background color is changing back to transparent. Now here, we are hard coding these color values, right? But let's say we want to implement this directive in such a way that the component can pass the value for the background color to this directive. Okay, so our requirement is we should be able to set the value for the background color from our component. And for that, we can make use of custom property binding. So what I'm going to do is, for this beta highlight directive class, let's first go ahead and let's create two properties. Let's create a default color property. It is going to be of type string, and initially let's set its value to transparent. In the same way, let's create another property called highlight color. Okay, it is also going to be of type string, and let's set its initial value to pink. Now, instead of using these hard-coded values, let's use these properties. So wherever we are setting the background color to transparent, there let's use the default color property. So for that, let's say this dot default color. And wherever we are using this value pink for the background color, there let's use the highlight color property. So this dot highlight color. And here also let's use the default color property. So this dot default color. Now if I save the changes, if I go to the web page, this directive should still be working the same. So when I hover over this host element, its background color is changing to pink. And when I move my mouse away from the host element, its background color is changing back to transparent. So the directive is still working as expected. The only thing is that now we have created a property, and then we are using the value of that property to set the background color. Now what we also want is we want to get the value of these properties from our component. Okay, so we want to pass the value from the component to the directive class. And for that, we can make use of custom property binding. And for using custom property binding, we decorate the properties with @input decorator, right? So let's decorate these two properties with @input decorator. And in order to use this @input decorator, we also need to import it from Angular Core. Let's decorate this second property also with @input decorator. And now we can bind these properties from our component. So let's go to app component.html, and on this div we are using the beta highlight directive. So on this host element, let's bind the default color property. So let's copy this property name. Let's use it here. And since we are doing property binding, we need to wrap it within square brackets like this. And then we can specify a TypeScript expression or a value for this property. So here we are going to specify a value, a string value. And since we are going to specify a string value, within these double quotes, we need to use a set of single quotes. And inside that, we can specify the string value. So let's say we want to have the default color as yellow. So let's specify that value. So now this value will be assigned to this default color property. And wherever we are using this default color property, there yellow will be assigned to this background property. Okay. In the same way, let's also bind this highlight color property. So let's wrap this highlight color property within square brackets, because again we are doing property binding here, and let's specify some value. So again, within double quotes, I'm going to use single quotes because here we are going to specify a string value. And let's say the highlight color is going to be red. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Now, when I hover over this host element, you will notice that its background color is changing to red. And when I move my mouse away from the host element, its background color is changing to yellow. Okay, so now we are passing the value for background color from our component. Alright, now here I also noticed a bug. So for example, when I reload this page, you will notice that initially the background color of this div is transparent, but it should be yellow because that's what the value we have assigned to the default color property, right? And this is because here we have set the initial value of this default color property to transparent. And that's why initially when the page loads, the background color of the host element is transparent. Now let's do one thing. Let's implement ng on init method. Okay, and let's also implement its interface. Okay, and inside this ng on init, let's set the background color. So here let's say this dot background equals default color. So this dot default, default color. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now, initially also when the page loads, the background color of this host element will be yellow. Now, when I move my mouse on the host element, it is red. And when we move our mouse away from the host element, it is again back to yellow. So in this way, we can do custom property binding with directives. All right. Now, if you remember, we have learned that ng style and ng class are also attribute directives. But when we use ng style and ng class, so for example, if I use ng style directive, we wrap this ng style within square brackets like this, right? And then we specify some TypeScript expression. But here, if you notice, we are using our custom directives without using any square brackets. Now, this is a typical use case, especially when you have only one property to bind, or at least one main property. In that case, what you can do is, let's say this highlight color is our main property. And we want to set this highlight color by using the selector of this directive, like we are doing for this ng style. Okay, so what we can do is we can specify an alias for this highlight color property. So inside these parentheses of this input decorator, we can pass an alias, and the alias should be the name of the selector for that directive. So in this case, app better highlight. Let's pass that. So now we have provided an alias for this highlight color property. And now we cannot use this highlight color in the property binding. Okay, in that case, it will throw an error. Let me remove this ng style from here. Okay, so if I try to use this highlight color property for property binding, Angular will throw an error because now we have provided an alias for this highlight color property. So let's remove this highlight color property as well. And now we can use this selector within square brackets. And now we can specify some value for it. So let's specify red. So here when we are specifying this value red for this app better highlight, this value will be assigned to this highlight color property. Okay, so if I save the changes, if I go to the web page, okay, so we need to specify that value within quotes. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page. And now you will notice that our directive is still working, but this time we have provided an alias for this highlight color property, and that alias is nothing but the selector name for that directive. And then we are using that selector just like we use ng style or ng class by wrapping it within square brackets. Another question which might come to your mind is how does Angular know if we want to bind the property of this div element or we want to bind the property of the directive? So for example, this div element does not have this app better highlight property or this default color property. But let's say in our directive, we have a property called, let's say, title. Okay, let's say it is also of type string. And initially, let's assign it with some value. Maybe this is title. Okay, and let's also decorate it with at input decorator. Okay, now when we bind this title property on this host element like this, let's say value is example title. Now, how does Angular know whether it should use the title property of this div element or the title property of this directive? Because this div is also going to have a title property, right? The answer is Angular just figures that out. Angular will first check the custom directive for these properties. So here we have specified this title property and we have this title property in our custom directive. So Angular will first check that property in the custom directive. Now, if it does not find that property in the custom directive, then it will look for the native property of the host element. Okay, in that case, it will bind the title property of the div element in this example. Okay, all right, so this is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.